internet, so don't worry. It's great having Andrew and Vivian with us tonight. And as I said to anyone who was listening at the beginning, as long as I've been involved with EMF, I thought it'd be a great idea to have one of the directors come, and it's taken me 4 directors to do it. But it's great to have Andrew with us. Andrew's got some stuff he's going to share with us, but before that, I thought it'd be good to get to know him a little bit. So Andrew, tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from, how you came to faith, that sort of thing.
Okay, well, thanks first of all for the invitation. It's great to be with you all this evening, and Vivian, who's definitely my better half, is with me, so that's good too. So yeah, I was born in Northampton and brought up in that area until I went off to university. But when I was 11, I became a Christian through reading the Bible. Although my family was more of a church going than, say, a Bible believing or gospel believing family. But when I was very young, I started to read the Bible. God put that desire, that idea in my mind to start reading the Bible. So when I was about 8 or 9, I started to do that. And when I was 11, that was when I understood for the first time that I wasn't yet a Christian, and I had to become a Christian. So that was when I came to faith at the age of 11. And it really wasn't long after that I began to feel that God was calling me to some kind of Christian ministry. For many years after that, I thought I would be a pastor in the UK somewhere. And years later, you know, the Lord took us in a different direction when I was married to Vivian, and I was studying at the Irish Baptist College in Belfast. The Lord sort of changed our thinking about the future, and we began to feel that we were being called out of the UK to mainland Europe. We'd been supporting EMF as a couple even before we were married. Vivian had introduced me to EMF. We started to support EMF together, pray for the missionaries together. And so when we felt a call to Spain ourselves, the natural thing was to contact EMF, which is what we did. And we did the EMF course from 1982 to 1983. And then in 1983, we went to Spain as EMF missionaries. And so we've been there doing that for most of the last 37 years since 1983.
Great. And you were, whereabouts in Spain were you? In two places in Spain, is that right?
We were in 4 places in Spain.
4 places in Spain, okay.
So we went first of all to Malaga on the south coast. We were sent to work with a church that was already associated with EMF at that time. Things didn't quite work out there the way they were supposed to. We arrived to find the church was in the process of splitting down the middle, which wasn't very easy for us at the beginning. We were still learning Spanish and all the rest of it. But anyway, we stayed there for 16 months. Then we moved up to a place called Alcázar de San Juan, which is where Pepe Moreno is now. So I was co-pastoring a church there with another EMF colleague, a Spanish colleague, for 3.5 years. And then I got a call to a church in the capital of the same province, Ciudad Real. And we were there 16 years. That was really what we considered to be our home in Spain, that place called Ciudad Real, which is kind of a smallish provincial capital of about 70,000 people, 125 miles south of Madrid. So our children grew up there, went to school there and so on. And then in 2004, I got a call to the church in Palma, and we were there for another 16 years until last August. Yeah.
So Palma to Mallorca doesn't sound like a great hardship to the mission field to be there for a time. So you pastored these churches in Spain and one in Mallorca. So you moved from Mallorca to Leicestershire, which is not the move that most people sort of go for. What possessed you?
Yeah, so a year ago, 13 months ago, basically the EMF trustees in their wisdom asked me if I would consider being a candidate for the post of director after Stephen Bowers retired in the autumn. After saying no several times to that, they insisted, the trustees By the way, let me say in brackets, I'm very thankful to have Darren as one of our trustees. Anyway, trustees, even though I hadn't even applied for the job as they'd asked me to do, I got a phone call saying, would you mind applying for this job? And I said, well, I'll apply for the job on one condition, that if I'm offered it, I'm allowed to turn it down. Because Vivian and I, at that time, didn't really feel at all that we were, we were going to move back from Spain. We just saw ourselves staying in Spain for the rest of our lives, basically. We felt we belonged in Spain. But anyway, I came over for the interview in February last year, and I was offered the job more or less straight away. And so we just, after several days of wrestling in prayer and talking to our kids and just trying to get some clarity, we did come to the conviction that it was the Lord who was indicating that this was the right step for us. So I accepted, and I told the church in Palma, and for the next 5 months we carried on there, and I carried on with my ministry there, and then we finished at the end of July, moved across here at the end of August, and it was to take up that role as EMF director. Yeah.
It's funny the way you made it sound like we were really desperate and we couldn't find anyone else to do the job.
Yeah.
What actually happened is we wrote a profile, and one of the trustees said, that looks a lot like Andrew. And we went, it does actually. And so when we suggested to you that maybe you want to apply, the first thing Andrew did was suggest somebody else who's one of the missionaries at EMF. But we actually did have other candidates who were okay, but we still thought Andrew would be a better one. So anyway, here you are. And we're very pleased that you agreed with us about that. So it sounds like to pull someone away from Mallorca must be a strong pull. So what does your job involve now, and how's things? It's a strange time to change jobs, but how are things going? What does it mean to be director of EMF?
Well, I mean, I've been in the job 6 months, so I'm still very much in the learning stage. So I tend to describe my job as I see it at the minute in terms of the people I'm in contact with in that job. So my priority was always going to be the missionaries. I just felt that the EMF director, the main job is to get to know the missionaries and encourage them, try to pastor them, look after them, make sure that any needs they had were being met as well as possible. So I always saw my number one priority as being caring for the missionaries, basically. So, and that still is what I regard as my priority. But obviously, it's not quite as simple as that. I'm a part of a team, a staff team of 5 full-time and 2 part-time team members. So we're the ones that, if you like, look after the running of the mission on a day-to-day basis. So I'm kind of the chairman, as it were, of that team of people. Very good team, by the way. And then, of course, I'm answerable to the EMF trustees, of which Darren, of course, is one. And we have 9 trustees at the minute and 2 possible new trustees in the pipeline. And so, of course, my job is to make sure as well that, EMF's objectives are being sort of properly fulfilled as best as possible. And of course, the other parts of my job is to be in touch with churches, like, this evening, churches and supporters of EMF all over the UK, maybe sometimes in other countries as well. So it's again representing the mission, speaking at churches, maybe the odd conference, and representing the mission as best as possible in this country. So those kind of 4 relationships, the missionaries, the staff team, the trustees and churches, are kind of the 4 main aspects of my work. So in practice, it means at the minute a lot of Zoom meetings. So I have Zoom meetings most days. I can have up to 5 or 6 Zoom meetings one after another on the same day. A lot of emailing, a lot of keeping in touch with the missionaries as best as I can. I get Vivian to join me, especially when we're talking to one of our EMF missionary couples. I like to get Vivian on those calls as well, because the wives have their needs just as much as the husbands have theirs. And so we're trying to, pastor and just take an interest in the missionaries and their families and their struggles, and ask how we can serve them better, basically. So that's how I really sort of see my job.
Great. And well, I'm just going to hand over to you. You've got some things you were going to tell us, and so I'll let you get on with it.
Okay, thanks again for the invitation, for the opportunity of sharing. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Now, I don't know whether any of you may have seen this website. It's called Worldometer or Worldometers, and it's basically an ongoing statistics of world population kind of website. So basically, you can see that the top figure is births that are taking place as we speak, as it were. So this is the current world population, at least roughly speaking. 7,854 million people, and you can see every day, like births today 325,000, deaths today, so population growth today so far is 188,000 and so on. Anyway, I don't know how accurate it is, but I think it reflects statistics about roughly how many births happen every year in the world, and then you can find out the statistics for each individual country and for days, weeks, months and years and so on. So what I like about this this particular website, you can also find out all the details about coronavirus on the same website, by the way. But what I like about it is it gives you some kind of realistic impression of the way that babies are being born, people are dying. Basically, the world population is growing quite rapidly all the time, even on a day-to-day basis. So I just put that on the screen as a kind of fairly realistic picture of how the world population is growing, even as we are meeting this evening. So basically, thinking about that 7.9 billion, if you're happy to use the American sense of the word billion, 7.9 billion or 7,900 million people in the world at the moment. And according to the Bible, every one of those people, without exception, including ourselves, is either what the Bible calls saved or lost. In other words, all of those 7.9 billion people on the planet are either on the way to heaven or, sadly, tragically, on the way to the other place, to hell. And just to underline the seriousness of the situation, the default position, we could say, of every human being is not saved, but lost. So lost is the norm, and saved is the exception to the norm. And that's because, of course, we're all, according to the Bible, conceived and born in sin. So the most important question that we need to ask and find the answer to is, how can we be saved? If all of this is true, how can we be saved? And thankfully, the same Bible that tells us that we're sinners and on the way to hell by nature also tells us how we can be saved. So how can we be saved according to the Bible? So if we go to Romans chapter 10, verses 13 to 15, the first part of verse 15, it says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent?" So do you see that the answer that the Apostle Paul gives to the question, how can we be saved, is, well, we can be saved by calling on the name of the Lord. That's how a person is saved. A person is saved by calling on the name of the Lord. Verse 13 of Romans 10, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But if we carry on reading, we'll see straight away that calling on the name of the Lord is not as easy as it may sound. Verses 14 and 15, how then will they call on him in whom they've not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they've never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they, i.e. the preachers, to preach unless they are sent? So for someone, anyone, to be saved from that default position as being lost, 5 things need to happen for someone to be saved. Firstly, someone needs to be sent. In other words, sent to announce the message of the gospel. Verse 15, how are they to preach unless they are sent? So in other words, that Paul is saying, how can anyone preach the gospel unless they are sent by God, sent by their local church to preach the gospel so that other people can hear it and believe and call on the name of the Lord and be saved. So the first essential step for anyone to be saved is for someone to be sent with the good news about Jesus. Secondly, the person who is sent needs to announce God's message as faithfully as possible, as clearly as possible. Verse 14, how are they to hear without someone preaching? So just being sent isn't enough. The person who is sent, in other words, the missionary, if you like, the evangelist, has to preach, has to announce the good news of the gospel. Thirdly, the person who is not yet saved needs to hear the message. Because if someone is preaching and I'm not listening, or if someone is preaching to the air and there's nobody listening, then nobody's hearing. So if nobody's hearing, how can they believe and then call on the name of the Lord and be saved? They can't. So it's not enough for people to be sent and preach the gospel. The people who are not yet saved, who are still lost in their sins, need to hear the message of the gospel. And then the fourth step is that unsaved person, that as yet unsaved person, needs to believe the message and trust Christ to save him or her. Verse 14 again, how will they call on him in whom they've not believed? In other words, for someone to call on the name of the Lord, first they have to believe the message that they've heard somebody preach about Jesus. And if they believe that message and trust Christ to save them, they call on the name of the Lord to do that, to save them. And then the last step, of course, is calling on the name of the Lord. The person needs to call on Christ to save him or her. Verse 13, we're back at the beginning again. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's how we can be saved, by hearing the message preached by the person sent, believing the message and trusting Christ, and then as a result of that, calling on the name of the Lord. That's how we can be saved. So there are 5 things here. There's a sending, there's a preaching, there's a hearing, there's a believing or trusting, and there's a calling on the name of the Lord. And mission, both the church's mission and our mission as part of that, is about the first 3 of those 5 things that need to happen for someone to be saved. We're not responsible for how the hearer responds to the message, but we are responsible to be part of the sending and the preaching and the hearing. In other words, the church's responsibility and our responsibility is to do everything we possibly can to make sure that as many people as possible actually hear the true Christian message, the good news centered on the person and work of the Lord Jesus Christ. So that's our mission. So concluding this brief reflection, we're all human beings, including all of us here this evening, are either saved or lost, according to the Bible. If we're already saved, then our job is to go or send, evangelize, make sure that people hear the good news about Christ. And if we're not yet saved, if we're still lost, which is our default position since we were conceived and born, we need to hear the message about Christ. We need to believe that message. We need to trust Christ as our Savior and call on his name to save us. So let's think about that as we look at a few slides together, slides that are about the story of EMF. So we'll start with the story of EMF quite briefly and what EMF basically is and does. And then we'll move on quickly from there to looking a bit about Europe and the situation in Europe, the spiritual situation in Europe at the present time. So at this point, I'm going to share my screen again. Right. So here we are in 1934 in Riga, in Latvia. And that was when James Stewart, who had been born in Glasgow in 1910, so he was 24 years old, and he'd been converted as a young guy, and he had a real passion for evangelism, for reaching people with the gospel. And so when he was still very young, he felt God calling him in a very clear way to leave his native Scotland and make trips to especially Eastern Europe in those days at the beginning, and to preach the gospel. All these meetings were organized. He was always preaching through translation. He could never speak any other language apart from English. So he got all these local Christians to translate his preaching. But in a short time, thousands of people heard him preach the gospel, and there were many, many conversions. It was like a mini revival in a number of Eastern European and Central European countries. And that was really the beginning, first of all, of EEC, not the European Economic Community, but the European Evangelistic Crusade, EEC. So in 1938, he was living in the States by then, North Carolina, and he founded the EEC, European Evangelistic Crusade. But in 1959, to cut a long story short, the British branch of that mission, started by James Stewart in America in 1938, the British branch became independent, and it became the EMF in 1959. So basically, James Stewart spent about 10 or 15 years traveling all over Europe, first from Glasgow and then from North America, making all these trips, preaching trips. And of course, when the Second World War came, and then after the Second World War, the starting of the Soviet Union and so on, the political situation changed dramatically in Europe, so that it was easier to evangelize then in more Western European countries than in what had been Eastern European countries. And so gradually the things shifted from Eastern Europe over to more to Western Europe. And that was when in 1959, the EMF was born as a kind of daughter, as it were, of the European Evangelistic Crusade that had been started by James Stewart in 1938. And the book there by Omri Jenkins, the first director and the founder of EMF, this is 2000, the year 2000, this book was published, 5 Minutes to Midnight, which is the story of EMF and mission to Europe. These are the principles of EMF. So we're committed to historic biblical Christianity, or Reformed theology, if you like. Number two, we work through local churches. So we emphasize the local churches in the UK that are supporting missionaries in different European countries, but we also emphasize the importance of local churches in all the countries where we have missionaries. So we like to keep the local church at the center of all that we do. We see ourselves as being a kind of a facilitating organization that helps churches, for example, in the UK, to support mission in other European countries through our mediation, because we have experience of working in Europe, and most of our missionaries are nationals working in their own countries, as it says in number 3, supporting indigenous workers. We see ourselves as helping churches, for example, in this country, to support like-minded missionaries working in different European countries. So number 3, we specialize in supporting national workers. So most of our workers, 80% of our workers, are national missionaries working in their own countries, in their own cultures, which we see has a lot of issues. That's not an exclusive thing. We do sometimes have British missionaries, like Vivian and myself. We went to Spain as British missionaries. So we were part of the 20% that were not national workers, but we've always had an emphasis on supporting national workers where possible. Number 4, planting and growing churches. Number 5, partnership between churches. So we're all the time trying to encourage churches in the UK to partner with missionaries in different European countries, and to build real relationships between the supporting churches and the missionaries that they're supporting. And then number 6, committed for the long term. Of course, we're not against short-term missionary work as well, but I suppose you would say that our emphasis has always been, and still is, on basically on long-term missionary work. And then, well, here are some fairly recent pictures of 4 different countries where we have workers in 15 countries at the moment. We have worked in other countries in the past that we're not working at the present time, and we hope to work in new European countries in the near future, God willing. So on the top left, you can see the situation in Budrio in the north of Italy, where Stefano and Jenny are doing a church plant. And these baptisms they had were at the end of the summer. You can see people wearing masks. It was still very much COVID situation. And so that's one example. And then to the right, top right, Ukraine, one of our missionaries there, Vitaly Mariash. His main job is to teach theology and work at the Kiev Theological Seminary. But he's also the co-pastor of a Reformed Baptist church in Kiev. And so that's another example. Then bottom left, Adam Urban is one of our younger workers working in a place called Chelsea in Poland, over to the east of Poland, but they're also doing church plants in 2 other places. This is one of them, which is called Łuków. In Łuków, these are towns of 10 or 20,000 people with no evangelical church. And it's great to see Adam and his colleague Ben Leah from America with a real vision for church planting. Their own church only has about 30 members, but in spite of that, they have a real vision to reach other towns and villages with the gospel, in spite of how small they are as a congregation. And then the bottom right is another example, Antonis in Thessaloniki in Greece. They have this kind of community center where they use it for their services and meetings, but also they have other activities where they try to engage local people and then share the gospel with them. So these are just a few examples of the kind of work we're involved in. It says here over 45 missionaries. At the minute we have 83 missionaries, 39 married couples and 5 widows or widowers. And that makes up the 83 missionaries at the present time, working in 15 different countries, which is basically Belgium, the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Norway, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Ireland, Romania, Spain, Switzerland, Ukraine, and the UK. They're the 15 countries where we have workers at the present time. This is PAL in a place in Romania. They're working in the Hungarian part of Romania, Transylvania. But we have 3 Hungarian-speaking couples. Of our 39 couples, 3 of them are working in Hungarian-speaking ministries, 1 in London and 2 in Transylvania. And PAL also teaches at the Hungarian Baptist Seminary in his area. So we just saw a quick one of Zbigniew Modnicki about baptizing somebody in Łódź in Poland. And this is Leonidas in Yanina in Greece, working especially among students. And you can see some of the young people there in the church. We're supporting literature work, especially in Poland with Christoph here and the Legatio publishing work. And then in Spain and the Spanish-speaking world, Editorial Peregrino, that I was quite involved in and still am. I'm still on the committee of Peregrino in Spain, and that has obviously interest throughout the Spanish-speaking world. So we're interested in seeing good books being published in all the different languages. I've just had a meeting today actually about a project that I started to try and get more good books into Hungarian. And so we're in contact with organizations like 9 Marks in America and Desiring God and the Gospel Coalition, with a view to getting more and more good gospel books into Hungarian as well as into other languages. We're also supporting training. We used to do our own training back from the 1960s up until a few years ago. And then we sold our headquarters at Gessens for all sorts of reasons I won't go into, but we're still interested in training future workers. And at the minute, we're supporting financially these 4 brothers. Ron Wild, top left, is from Paris, studying at London Seminary, and he finishes his 2 years there this summer, and then hopes to go back to Paris and be involved in church planting in Greater Paris area. Top right, Bruno Pires is from Portugal and is studying at Portuguese Bible Institute. Bottom left, Manuel Morelli from Ravenna in Italy is in his first of 2 years at London Seminary. And then on the bottom right, Michael Tsoutsas is a young guy, only about 18 years old, in his first year at Athens Bible College. So, you know, we're sort of subsidizing the studies and the other kind of financial needs of these 4 students to different degrees. And this is something we're interested in doing increasingly. In fact, right now we have a number of candidates applying to our training fund for help in the next academic year as from September. So that's another thing that EMF is doing. Now, moving from EMF to Europe in general. So the next few slides really are all about trying to convey how desperately needy Europe as a continent is of the gospel right now. So Europe has a debated number of countries. You would think it would be easy to say, how many countries are there in Europe? 50. It's not as easy as that. There are between 44 and 51 countries in Europe, depending what countries you count as being in Europe. I mean, is Russia in Europe? The answer is that 23% of it is, 77% of it is not. Is Turkey in Europe? 5% yes, 95% no. But part of Turkey is in Europe, the western part, obviously. And then the same applies to some countries like Azerbaijan and Armenia. And there are lots of sort of debated countries as to where they actually belong, whether in Asia or in Europe or whatever. So there's anything between 44 and 51 countries in Europe, but there are about 740 million people, of which only 2.5% would be evangelical Christians. and that figure is probably, if anything, a bit high. So it's probably not even quite as high as 2.5%. And for that reason, it is the least evangelized continent on earth at the present time. And 16 countries, that's 1/3 of all the countries in Europe, have 1% or less evangelical Christians. So, 1 in 100 or less. In 16, 1 in every 3 European countries, that's the situation. Now, this graph here shows a comparison between 5 world regions. You can see at the bottom of the slide. They're not strictly 5 continents, but 5 regions. And it's comparing from 1960 to 2010, the growth there has been of evangelical Christianity in those 5 regions. So what you see here is that, first of all, Europe now is by far the lowest of the 5 regions. If you look at the orange columns, which are the 2010 columns, so Europe, compared to the others, is the lowest of them all. But it's also the one that has grown the least since 1960. So again, if you compare the growth in Africa, for example, just to give you an example, this sounds a shocking thing to say. There are far more Christians in Nigeria than in the whole of Europe. Far more Christians just in Nigeria than in the whole of Europe. And that's just an example of the growth that's been in Africa and in Latin America and the Caribbean, but not so much growth in Europe. And then the next slide shows a different picture, which is comparing the growth of Islam, atheism, and evangelicalism since 1900. And again, you can see the same 2 things happening. There is far more growth of Islam, but especially of atheism and secularism, than there is of evangelical Christianity. And so, for all these reasons, Islam has grown, atheism is growing rapidly all the time, but evangelicalism has grown as well, but nowhere near as much as these other things, atheism and Islam especially. These are the 15 countries where we're working at the moment. And again, you can see some of these figures are probably a bit inflated, but it was from last year, 2020, these statistics. And so according to these statistics, the UK has roughly 8.8% evangelicals. And then you go down from there to, at the right-hand side, Poland and Greece with only 0.2. 0.2 is 2 in 1,000. So that means 998 of every 1,000 are not evangelical Christians, and only 2 out of every 1,000 are evangelical Christians. And that's the situation in Poland and Greece. And it's not much better in about 10 of those other countries. Okay, so the figure for the UK may be a bit high. It may not be 8.8. It may be, I don't know, 5% or 6% or 4%. But it's still, generally speaking, quite a bit higher than a lot of other European countries. And I think that has something to do with the Reformation and the Reformation legacy. I know we complain, and rightly so, that we're turning our backs on God in this country and we're going in a downhill direction very fast. I'm sure all of that has got a lot of truth to it. But at the same time, we still have some benefits that come from 500 years of Reformation influence, which not all those other countries have had. So, for example, there's never been, if you like, a lasting Reformation or revival in countries like Spain. The Reformation was stamped out in Spain by the Spanish Inquisition. Believers were forced into exile or be killed. And so it was for 300 years, from the 16th century to the 19th century. We know very little about any gospel churches in Spain for those 300 years. So, Spain and other countries have not had the Reformation influence that the UK has had, and maybe some other Northern European countries. So that just gives you an idea of comparisons between countries. Why is Europe so hardened to the gospel? Lots of reasons, but here are 3 of the big ones. Unbiblical versions of Christianity. I'm thinking of Roman Catholicism, Greek Orthodoxy. I'm thinking of liberal Protestantism, thinking of Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. So there are lots of unbiblical versions of Christianity. And the problem with that is that they create a false sense of security in which many Europeans consider themselves Christians, but they don't realize that they're in a false kind of Christianity and not true biblical gospel Christianity. And that creates a very false impression of what it really means to be a Christian. Of course, Islam is growing all the time. Agnosticism, atheism, and secularism are growing all the time. So these are 3 of the big reasons, of the many reasons, why Europe is so hard to the gospel right now. But not everything is negative. There are some encouragements. So just quickly, evangelicalism is growing in Europe. It's growing very slowly compared to other religions or atheism. But there is some evangelical growth. People are hearing the gospel. more and more people are coming to faith. New churches are being planted. So not everything is by any means all negative or bleak, but generally speaking, the need is still very great. Number two, top right, lots of these are ministries from the States that many of us are familiar with and benefit from, like Desiring God, Gospel Coalition, Nine Maps and Ligonier and so on. They are increasingly having an influence in other European countries. A lot of their materials are being translated into other languages. They're holding conferences. They're doing podcasts with subtitles. So there is an influence of healthy evangelicalism spreading gradually over the continent of Europe, but it is a very slow process. Number three, church planting is growing. More and more churches are getting a vision for planting churches, both where they are and in other countries. And so Acts 29, European Leadership Forum and so on, other organizations are specializing in planting new gospel churches where up until now there hasn't been a gospel church. And even some of our EMF missionaries were involved in that in Poland and other countries. And then number four, there is more growth in some countries than in others. So here are 6 countries where in the last 20 or 30 years there has been significant growth, more than in the rest of Europe probably. Albania is a classic case. 30 years ago, it claimed to be an atheistic country. And in the last 20 years or so, since the end of communism, as it were, the gospel has really taken off in Albania and in some of these other countries, Romania, Ukraine, Hungary, France, and Ireland. Some of these cases are still relatively small. France, for example, there's not dramatic growth at the moment. If you compare now with 20 years ago, you do notice the difference. More and more churches are being planted in France today than probably any other time in recent history. So just some prayer points for more gospel workers to be sent. This is on the lines of the Romans 10 passage I shared earlier. If what Romans 10 says is true, and it is, then we need to be praying along these lines for more gospel workers to be sent, more people to hear the gospel and be impacted by it, more gospel churches to be planted, more disciple-making disciples, and for the Lord to use even this COVID pandemic to make people more open to the gospel all over Europe. So that's the end of that bit. And if there are any questions, and if there's time for questions, Darren, and answers.
Definitely be good to have some questions and a time to pray as well. And then I'll put people into breakout groups and they can chat and do tea and coffee, their own tea and coffee, unfortunately. But yeah, but any questions for Andrew?